I'll now start my presentation. I hope you're all able to see it. I just want to confirm that once. Is it visible?
Yes, sir, it is visible.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I think I will start. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to be here. In fact, in the webinar, we all know we are going through very difficult times, and this COVID crisis has created a situation where everything has to be done online. So this is sort of a nice engagement that ASME NIT Silchar chapter has started, and I'm really happy that the first person is someone who works at the interface of materials and mechanical engineering, as this is one of the most important things any field needs, interdisciplinary nature. So my talk again is shaped towards that particular aspect. In fact, I'm going to look at a metallurgical approach towards understanding mechanical behavior of materials. So the talk will contain several aspects of metallurgical engineering as well as mechanical engineering. And in fact, we will see what kind of concepts can be derived from each one of them. So this is my first slide, and as you can see, and as Samudra already mentioned, that I am an alumnus of an NIT as well, and I can certainly understand the enthusiasm a student in NIT carries with himself. In fact, from my experience, as far as I have experienced in my undergraduate as well as my PhD life, I have seen that NIT students have more enthusiasm, are more uh, enterprising than an IIT student, because IIT students generally have to look at several more things, are always looking for more opportunities, where an NIT student is able to focus more on his strengths and keeps developing them for future. So from the perspective of a faculty in IIT Delhi, I really appreciate NITians and invite all of you to try and, if you want to appear for GATE and pursue a career in materials engineering, you're all welcome, because nowadays there is a lot of focus of mechanical engineering and related subjects in the field of material science. And today the talk is going to be shaped in that sense to show you what kind of materials we work in, what are the kind of directions we can look at, and to generate some interest in this area. So the outline of the talk is like this. I'm going to talk about a few new materials which you might have experienced or you might have never heard of before. And then I'm going to talk about some new mechanical testing techniques, which again are something which is very innovative and are at the cutting edge of research. And finally, I'm going to talk about new manufacturing techniques. Of course, this is of interest to a lot of mechanical engineers because they have all heard of this this next manufacturing, or the you hear that as the fourth generation of manufacturing, where you're going to print metals. It's not like printing a piece of paper. You are going to print real objects by using a 3D printer. So we are going to look at aspects of this and the materials aspect as well as the mechanical aspects of these particular topics. And it's going to be interdisciplinary in nature. So I'm going to show you where you can play a role and where materials engineers also learn the subject of mechanical engineering. So to start with, I'll just go with my first part where we talk about new materials. And here my focus will be on fracture of bulk metallic glasses. So to understand metallic glasses, you have to first look at, let us say there is a metallic liquid. Okay, on the far right, there's a metallic liquid. And in a metallic liquid, if you see, the atoms are going to have a certain configuration. And this configuration is going to be random. These atoms are not going to be in any order. They are going to be random and they are going to be scattered. Okay, so we call it a disordered state. Now, when we start cooling it, see the temperature is going to reduce from right to left. So when I start cooling this material, it essentially the volume shrinks, right? This is what you see. You see for materials, you have also heard of this in probably casting, that when you start cooling a liquid, it starts shrinking. Okay. And then suddenly at the melting temperature, it undergoes a lot of volume contraction. And this is called a discontinuity. You always see a discontinuity even in the free energy when you go from a liquid state to a solid state. And this leads to crystallization. And crystallization here is nothing but the atom sitting in a very nice order or an orderly fashion. And you would have heard of several crystals by the name of, let's say, body-centered cubic, face-centered cubic, and all different kinds, maybe even hexagonal close-packed. So with these kind of crystal structures, you essentially see that the metal has solidified. Okay. And the volume keeps shrinking. You sometimes have shrinkage, you sometimes have different kind of defects, you have, residual strains, and all those aspects come into the picture of solidification. However, there is another regime where when you cool it rapidly enough, you can actually make sure that the liquid structure is preserved. Okay, and the concept that this entails is known as the glass transition. Okay, and it happens over a range of temperature known as TG. This is again very well known in polymers, and I'm not aware how many people have learned about polymers. But essentially what happens is you sort of avoid crystallization, although that is the most likely process which is available to the material. Okay, it is thermodynamically favorable for a material to become a crystalline material than a glass. But if you can rapidly cool it, you can still preserve the structure of the liquid. And then when we look at the micrograph, when you look at this material under the microscope, for most metals which have crystallized, you will see something like this. I mean, of course, you're not going to see balls. What you're going to see is you're going to see pockets. Okay, and each of these pockets represents grain. Okay, there is one pocket which has a certain orientation of these atoms. That is your grain one, and the others have different orientations, and they are separated by something called a grain boundary. In contrast, in metallic glasses, you have several components. You will have here in this case, you can see 4 elements. 4 different kind of spheres have been used. And because of this, the structure is very random. And since the structure is very random, you cannot really delineate a space where there is a fixed organization of atoms, or you could say fixed order of atoms. So these are highly disordered atoms which are sitting in a pool. Okay, and this is a solid. Don't think this is a liquid. This is still a solid. And the feature that you need to remember is that in grains, because of this fixed orientation, you are allowing dislocations to be inside the crystal. You are able to define something called as a dislocation. And what are dislocations? This is something you would have seen in your mechanical metallurgy. I'm not sure if you have a course on mechanical metallurgy, but nevertheless, what happens is there is a plane of atoms which is going to move relative to the other. If you can see this GIF that I have posted here, when you shear an object, you essentially create a small dislocation which looks like an inverted T, and that moves across the crystal and cuts through it. So you are able to accommodate plastic strain by this dislocation. But you cannot define such a thing in metallic glasses, because you can obviously see here we can define a crystallographic plane over which this dislocation is sliding, and there are identical bonds which are there above the half plane and below the half plane. So you essentially have the same environment, and there is no energy loss or net energy loss when this dislocation moves from one end to the other, right? You're always preserving the number of bonds. But in a metallic glass, you can never achieve that, right? You cannot define a dislocation. So what is so great about metallic glass? I don't know what has happened to my presentation. Just give me a second. I think there is an issue. Yeah. Sorry. Yes. So what is so great about metallic glasses? So your metallic glasses just look like a crystalline metals such as steel. Okay, it will have a very shiny luster. In fact, it is much more shinier than steels. Okay. Now, the difference is that when you have a steel base and you drop a ball bearing over the steel base, you see that the ball only bounces a few times. I will let this GIF in front of you. I'll leave it in front of you. And you can just observe that when this person drops the steel ball over the steel plate, it bounces about 4 times. But when you do the same on a metallic glass base, you see that the ball keeps bouncing on it. You might have heard of this thing known as coefficient of restitution, but coefficient of restitution is not surface dependent. And in this case, it appears that metallic glass offers a greater amount of bounce, a greater amount of coefficient of restitution, or in other words, here you can say that the kinetic energy of the ball is being completely returned back to it in an ideal situation. So metallic glasses are able to absorb the energy and immediately release it back to the steel ball. So what it implies is that if you look at a stress strain curve and you look at several aspects of the stress strain curve, you have an elastic region, a yield point, and an ultimate fracture point. If you look at the elastic region, the steel will have a lesser elastic region than that of a metallic glass. As in, steel will yield at a lower stress than a metallic glass. And that is what we see. We see that the yield stress of steel is about 400 to 500 MPa, and the yield strain is also 0.2%. On the other hand, metallic glasses are about 10 times more strong, at least, or maybe 5 times more strong, and the yield strain at least is 10 times higher, which is exceptional for a material of this class. So as we can see, these are indeed very capable of being stronger than any other conventional crystalline material. And that is why metallic glasses have got a separate space for themselves. If you look at all the materials in a curve where we compare the strength and elastic limit. As you can see, metals typically have higher strength but lower elastic limit. Whereas metallic glasses, you will see they have both high strength and high elastic limits. This is known as an Ashby chart, and we will look at some more as we go ahead. There are some issues with BMGs as well, and we will look at them. If you look at a metallic glass which is compressed, it shows a lot of plasticity. Essentially, here there's a curve. You see the engineering stress versus engineering strain curve, and you're doing a uniaxial compression test. What you see is that a metallic glass can undergo a strain of about 0.8%. Sorry, yeah, 0.8% when you are going to do it at 300 Kelvin. But when you do the same test at 77 Kelvin, it shows more plasticity. And when you see the material after it has been compressed, you will see that it contains several of these slip line like features. But then when I do a tension test, what really happens is that the material does not show anything beyond the yield stress. Again, you see that the elastic portion, it goes up to 2000 MPa. But then after that, the material fails. You don't see any ductility. And that is what we also see. We see some kind of a brittle failure. So this material appears to have plastic deformation only during compression and not during tension. So that is a major problem, because in materials that are going to be used for structural applications, you would want them to deform plastically also. They want them to undergo graceful failure. And otherwise, this would lead to catastrophic failure of materials. So now we are going to look at some deformation mechanisms to understand why it does not have tensile ductility. And the reason is, if you look at an amorphous structure, you really cannot define dislocations, as I had mentioned earlier. So what you do is you can define small clusters which are known as shear transformation zones, where one half of this shear transformation zone moves relative to the other and accommodates strain. And this was developed by Ali Argan in his classical paper in 1977. This theory is then used to understand what really happens when plastic strain is developed in a metallic glass. Your shear transformation zones essentially join together inside the material one by one collectively and lead to the formation of a macroscopic shear band, which in reality looks like in this picture, looks like what you see in this picture. So you will see a lot of these surface offsets, and this is a bent metallic glass pin. And these surface offsets are nothing but representations of a macroscopic shear band. And this implies that the complete plastic strain has localized in these shear bands, and the areas where the shear bands are not present are elastic or do not have any stress. Now, what are the implications of these shear bands on fracture toughness? Fracture toughness, as you know, is a property that is extremely related to plasticity. If a material has got higher or ability to take more plastic strain, it will have higher fracture toughness. That is what we learned, because we talk about the area under the stress strain curve till failure, which means that there's a large scope for your plasticity to play a role in fracture toughness. But fracture toughness, of course, for mechanical engineers has a very different definition. We are not going to look at the stress strain curve itself. We are going to define a crack, and we are going to see how much can the material prevent the crack from propagating. So you assume the presence of a flaw, and then you apply loads, and then you see how much resistance a material can offer. And that, of course, depends on the amount of plasticity that develops in front of a crack tip. So with that, going with that, when people measured this fracture toughness, which is measured as K1C, where 1 actually implies that you are applying load in the mode 1 condition, and then when you compare it with the yield strength in this Ashby chart and you put all the materials here, you'll see that metallic glasses are again very high toughness materials. At least they are very close to that of your conventional alloys, and also have very high yield strength. So it is a very rare material where you have high yield strength and fracture toughness. Unlike ceramics, if you look at ceramics, ceramics only have very high yield strength. Let us look at ZrO2, MgO, as well as aluminum oxide. You see, they have very low fracture toughness, probably like 1 MPa root meter, but they have very, very good yield strength. So metallic glasses can actually be an interface, or rather better materials than both ceramics and metals. And that is why these metals are considered very nice. But if you notice one thing, that metallic glasses also have a very high range of toughness. It can also be only having a toughness of 10 MPa root meter, but also can be as high as 100 MPa root meter. As you can see, the y-axis here is a logarithmic axis, and hence from 10 to 100, the toughness of your metallic glass can vary. So this high level of variability brings in the question that what all factors decide the toughness of metallic glasses? What is the inherent physical property or mechanical property that controls your metallic glass fracture toughness? So to this, they came up with a criteria. This was by Lewandowski and Greer, who worked with Wei Hua Wang, and they came up with this criteria that below a certain shear by bulk modulus ratio, you will have tough metallic glasses. And the logic was that since shear modulus is the measure of resistance to shear, if you have a lower shear modulus, it can deform more plastically, or the material is able to deform plastically at lower stresses. And the logic implied that if your shear is easier, then the material will undergo plastic deformation instead of failing in a brittle fashion, and hence your plasticity is higher and also toughness is going to be higher. And it certainly worked for some materials. And now they also modified the criterion further to say that your shear modulus is related to the Poisson's ratio, as in it is inversely proportional to the Poisson's ratio, and hence if you have a higher Poisson's ratio, you will have a higher toughness. And this became a sort of a benchmark for deciding which metallic glasses are going to be tough and which are not going to be. But unfortunately, this criterion does not always work, because what we see is that when you have a collection of different metallic glasses, they observed that while a critical Poisson's ratio of 0.32 is there, okay, below which you are going to have brittle glasses, for example, iron-based glasses, magnesium-based glasses, and calcium-based glasses, they have very, very low fracture toughness. Okay, these have been marked with different kind of symbols, and they have also been labeled. And when you go at higher Poisson's ratio, you expect all of them to have very high fracture toughness. For example, copper-based, iron-based, some zirconium-based also, they show very high fracture toughness. But if you look at some of these small data points on the right side, top right side, you see gold-based metallic glasses have very low fracture toughness, whereas palladium-based glasses almost are as high as 200 MPa root, MPa, sorry, not 200 kilojoule per meter square. Your gold-based metallic glasses are only 10 kilojoule per meter square. Okay, this is the fracture energy, another way of representing your fracture toughness. So gold doesn't really follow this rule, because according to Poisson's ratio rule, higher the Poisson's ratio, the higher the fracture toughness. So it obviously does not follow this particular. So this criterion may not always work, and there is a reason why, because you're using an elastic parameter to understand plasticity, which is always a questionable thing to do. So what do we do? So as mechanical engineers and materials engineers, we look at a structural perspective. That is most important, because mechanical engineers cannot really use an elastic parameter to define a plastic situation, right? So what we'll do is we'll look at the notch which is about to nucleate a crack. What is the nature of this particular notch? Okay, so there is a stress concentration, and obviously ahead of the stress concentration, when you apply load, so remember that the load is being applied in mode 1, and which means that you can assume that in the plane of paper, this notch is being loaded. Okay, in the so essentially force is being applied vertically to this particular picture. So you see several shear bands that are formed in front of the notch tip. And what happens is when a crack really nucleates, it forms within one of these shear bands. And that is very evident here. You can see on the left, this is just before when a crack forms, and on the right, a crack actually goes through one of these shear bands. Not all of these shear bands are cracks. They can be potential cracks, but only one of them is chosen to be the vehicle for the crack to propagate. So then it was found by several researchers. In fact, that Parag, who actually is a faculty in IIT Bombay, he came up with this criterion that a critical strain has to be reached within this shear band for this to nucleate a crack. And that critical strain was given as 10%. Okay. And this is followed for all metallic glass systems. You will see that shear bands form in front of a notch, and then within the shear bands, you can always form a crack. And this kind of a shear band envelope forms in them. This is very unique to metallic glasses. You will never see them in crystalline metals. So the key concept now is that when you want to compare it, and this is where our innovation as a metallurgist comes in, when two BMGs of positions are unloaded at the same displacement or strain level, you're going to have two pictures. So on the left side, it is WIT alloy 1, that is one class of BMG. And on the right side, this is WIT 105. And they have been unloaded at the same displacement level after they have been deformed to the same displacement level. On the left side, you will see that the notch contains less number of shear bands, whereas on the right side, you will see more number of shear bands. So what does it imply? Assuming that my plastic strain distribution is constant over all the shear bands, okay, in both the pictures, assuming that the strain is distributed over all the shear bands equally, on the right side, you will see that each shear band will have lesser amount of strain. Whereas on the right side, on the left side, you will see that each shear band has higher strain. Okay. So what does it imply? It implies that the figure on the left, or the material on the left, which is WIT 1, can undergo or can attain critical strain in one of the shear bands at a much lower load, and hence it will have a lower fracture toughness. So using that idea, what I did, in fact, was to collect the shear band envelope on several metallic glasses. We examined about 22 systems, and then what we did was we found the number of shear bands actually correlates with the fracture toughness of the material. So once you're able to measure the number of shear bands in front of the notch tip, you can actually calculate or estimate the fracture toughness of a material. And this was one of the ideas with which a materials engineer can understand concept of mechanics, or even apply empirical theory to know what the mechanical property of a material is. So this is very unique to a metallic glass system and cannot be done for other materials. Now coming to the second part of my talk, I am going to talk about the mechanical behavior of submicron and nanoscale crystals. Now this is not a very easy job, because as you see, when you do your lab scale tests, you need millimeter size specimens. And what I'm talking about is here the specimens which are smaller than the, or rather thinner than your thickness of your hair. Okay, so we are going to test these materials, and how to do it is the question. So there is a lot of innovation in this aspect. Nanomechanics has developed quite a bit. We look at something called as a transmission electron microscope, very popularly known as TEM. And here what you do is you apply a high voltage and you let an electron beam pass from the top from an electron gun. And then the electron beam passes through several magnetic lenses. And what these magnetic lenses do is they condense this beam and then they pass through a specimen, okay, which is placed on a holder. And finally, the specimen has to be transparent to the electron beam, and then it goes to a fluorescent screen and a camera. Now, there are two types of detectors. When you have this transmitted beam, it can collect two types of information. For example, when you go to, let's say, do an X-ray, your X-ray passes through your body, right? So it can pass through your skin very easily, but not very well through your bones. So you obtain a certain contrast. Your bones will appear white, whereas your skin won't appear, or everything will appear dark. And then the doctor is able to identify fracture. Similarly, there is a bright field mode in TEM where the camera or the screen will only observe whatever the electrons are passing through well, and what they are not able to pass through well are shown as dark spots. And this is called the bright field imaging. TEM has another mode where you can get diffraction information. What really happens is William Bragg came with a concept that materials at the crystallographic level can also diffract light or radiation or electron beams. And this diffraction will give us a lot of information. What information does it give? It gives us crystallographic information. In crystals, when they have regular planes, these planes act as diffraction slits or diffraction gratings, which can cause interference in the electromagnetic radiation, which is your electron beam. And these interference patterns essentially are captured at the fluorescent screen, and these appear as a spotted pattern. Because your electron beam is also a spot, these spots are diffracted spots. And when you do an imaging with one of these diffracted spots, which is shown in the inside of figure A, you will see that you will obtain an image which has a dark background but bright spots. So the imaging done by the diffracted beam is known as dark field imaging. So let's not go into details of that. What it essentially implies is that if you are going to use one of the diffracted spots, diffraction spots shown in the inset of A, you are going to obtain a feature that is captured by the property of the particular diffracted spot. Okay. And you can use this this technique is very popular to especially determine dislocations. See, you can see several dislocations here, and the bright field as well as dark field image, these show some contrast because light beam can also diffract through a dislocation because it also certainly represents a mismatch in the order of the plane, or rather the arrangement in an atomic plane. So now we are going to do mechanical testing inside the TEM. That is how we are going to do, because we have to observe the stress and strain. We have to observe what happens inside the material. That is the purpose. So what really happens is there are several companies which have now developed the sample holder, okay, in this fashion, where you will keep the sample on the right hand side of this holder, and on the left hand side, this is a movable screw, okay. So this movable screw can move in the tensile direction as depicted here. And what we do is we are going to use something called as focused ion beam, where a gallium ion are pumped onto a surface and these actually cut through the material and will give you the desired shape. And why do we do this? Because we need to form a tensile sample of this nature. Okay, this is a very nice looking. Look at the scale bar. It is only 10 micron. And you see that this is a very nice cylindrical dog bone specimen. And to do these tests, we essentially have this gripper. Okay, this is called a diamond gripper. It's made of diamond, and it can go at the nanoscale level. It can go and hold the sample in this particular fashion as shown in the right side figure. This is going to show a tensile test on a copper sample. So we are going to look at the deformation of some single crystals. And with that, I start with deformation of copper. If you see this video, you are now loading it in a tensile fashion. The gripper is on the bottom end, bottom left, and it is pulling the sample. As you can see, there is some activity in the material and it immediately fractures. Okay. So what really happens here? first, when you have a tensile specimen in a single crystal, you do not have a lot of defects at the submicron level because your defects are going to be statistically less in a material which is so small. So your material has to nucleate dislocations, and that is why the strength is also high. So when a dislocation is nucleated from a source, it will start moving on a particular slip plane. And as it keeps moving, the dislocation will see the surface and escape. And as we had seen in the previous figure in the first few slides, you had seen that the dislocation moves from one end to the other. When it escapes, it creates a surface offset. And now what has happened is the cross-section area across this plane has reduced compared to that of the specimen, which means that this is going to experience higher strain because my strain is nothing but force divided by cross-section area. And hence, this will lead to a further stress concentration in the sample and something called as localization occurs. As a result, these samples, although they have very high strengths, see, look at the kind of strengths you can obtain in copper single crystal. Your actual strength of copper in the bulk form is about 600 MPa or even lesser. But when you go to a very, very, very low size scale, you see that the true is almost 6 GPa. This is about 10 times higher. So you can actually strengthen the material quite a bit, but the ductility is very, very poor. For a 75 nanometer sized material, the ductility is very poor. You don't really see that the plasticity is going to occur in this because dislocations escape. And this is also seen for different kind of films. You will see some kind of brittle failure and other kinds of features. So now if I am going to look at BCC materials, again a similar thing was observed. We are looking at a titanium zirconium alloy, and this has a BCC phase. Here is the dark field image of the same. And I'm going to show you another video. And here your tensile axis is diagonal, and you see that this sample is yielding, and then you will see the formation of a offset. Okay, and this offset grows and this sample no longer undergoes uniform elongation. Uniform elongation is necessary for a sample to exhibit ductility, and that does not happen. So if you look at the sequence of events, what happens is at 0% strain, you don't see much. As you increase the strain, certain features start developing in the crystal, and you see there are two slip bands which are activated. These are snapshots taken from the same TEM video. And you see that the material has undergone shear over one plane, and after that, the other plane which was activated initially at 3.1%, that stops getting slipped. And failure has already occurred. We did the same experiment with an amorphous material. Here you see there is a difference in the diffraction pattern. You see a small round halo, and that is called as a ring, diffraction ring. So instead of a spot pattern, you find a ring, diffused ring in metallic glasses because it does not have crystallographic planes. So all atoms will scatter either X-rays or electron beam in this fashion. So you always observe a very scattered peak in X-ray, or you will see a diffraction ring when you do a TEM of a metallic glass sample. Remember, your samples have to be very thin because your electron beam has to pass through it. So the thickness of these samples is going to be less than 100 nanometer, less than 100 nanometer, but your width can be slightly higher. So our idea is we need to make sure that ductility improves. And for that, we see that dislocation should not be allowed to escape the crystal. If they are allowed to escape the crystal, immediately deformation will concentrate at that line in which the dislocation has exited the crystal, and it will keep increasing the stress over it. So how do we do that? We are going to build a specimen which has got barriers in it. We are going to make materials which has barriers in it. And here twins are being used as barriers. And wherever a dislocation starts propagating, it goes and encounters a twin boundary. And it cannot move further because the orientation across the twin boundary will be different, and this dislocation cannot go through them. Another way is to use irradiation based bubbles. So here helium bubbles have been put in the sample where they interact with dislocations and don't allow them to pass through. So you're essentially making sure that dislocations are not able to exit the crystal and to interact with other dislocations in the crystal to give more strength as well as higher plasticity. So what we tried was we used a amorphous crystalline bilayer. It's a very interesting experiment in the sense that nobody knows what will happen if you stack them up together and you start stretching them. And in this experiment, we did exactly that. We used a crystalline layer which has got a very similar crystal structure to the one we examined before, and then amorphous layer which is very thin over this. And I'm going to show this video of the experiment which we did. And it's very sped up because it's otherwise going to take a long time. If you observe, nothing happens for some time, and then you see the observation, or you observe basically the formation of very thick bands, and these thick bands extend throughout the crystal. And finally, the amorphous phase starts deforming a bit, and you see that the crystal will fracture. Okay, so at this moment, your uniform elongation stops when the amorphous material has yielded. Okay. And let us look at the salient features one by one. If you look at the orientations have been given by these diffraction patterns, and you have in one case at 0% strain, nothing really happens. If the strain is 2.2%, a diffused band forms in the crystal at the bottom left corner. Here we have just rotated that image that was shown for ease of observation. And then you see that at 2.8% strain, perpendicular to these diffused bands, there are three thick bands which are forming, 3 or 4. In fact, you can see the fourth one is very mild, but these are essentially the thick bands that form. But these thick bands are not able to penetrate the amorphous layer. So what happens? You have the formation of another thick band very far away and another very diffused band. Now this diffused band may not be even visible to you. Okay, that is because this plane is extremely or this plane is actually perpendicular to the viewing plane of the electron microscope, and that is why we are only able to see the edge, and it will be very diffused. In fact, we won't be able to see the contrast very well, but there is a diffuse band which exists. We can see this when we change the contrast of the image. But a shear offset also forms, but the shear offset does not grow. On further deformation, up to 12% strain, the material can get deformed. So if you remember, the crystalline phase slides can only deform up to 4.5%, but you can get about 12% elongation when you put an amorphous layer, which is almost 3 times higher. So how are we able to obtain this disproportionate increase in the strain to failure when both phases together can only, even if you linearly add their strains to failure, you only get about 8%. So why is this happening? So if we analyze it, what really happened is we did another test to observe what these bands are. So these dark bands are nothing but slip over different dislocation slip planes. And these different dislocation slip planes were identified as your 110 and bar 110. So these are just notations for different crystallographic planes in the material. Now, if you want to understand the process, you look at an amorphous layer has been kept, or the crystalline layer. Okay, and let us say your corner is nucleating your dislocation slip, and dislocations start propagating over this particular slip plane, and as they hit the interface they are not able to go through it, so a shear step is not able to form. Okay, so the amorphous layer is essentially blocking this particular slip, and this will lead to a pileup, which means that dislocations will interact more, but since they cannot go further, this particular plane will become strain hardened. And then what happens is that you will now activate another slip plane, okay, in some other part of the crystal, which is what was happening. As you saw as thick dark band, dislocations were getting activated on another part of the crystal, and these dislocations start moving towards the amorphous layer, and again they get trapped. In fact, they get blocked, and they do not allow further dislocations to develop along this plane, which strain hardens the crystal further. Now, if several of these events occur all over the crystal, it actually leads to homogeneous deformation or distribution of strain in the crystal because of activation of slip on different areas of the crystal. So this is another way where you see that mechanical testing at this scale can actually help you develop materials for devices or sensors which will have moving parts. And you can see that mechanical reliability or structural reliability can be obtained by doing careful experiments and trying to understand what are the core principles that lead to higher ductility or higher plasticity. The final part, I'm going to talk about structure property correlations in 3D printed materials. And this is very interesting because this is a new manufacturing method. in this manufacturing method, what really happens is that you have a material in the powder form, and then you use a power source to melt or sinter the material. So in 3D printing, what you are doing is we are now optimizing the future of manufacturing. Okay, and I'm going to show you how. Let's say you want to make an engine blisk. Okay, this is an engine blisk. It's used in your propellers, or if you use your turbines, or if you use your jet engines, you'll always see this blisk. This is like a fan. Now, if you want to build this fan, your typical metallurgist will tell you that you will go, you will cast this material, whatever the blisk is made of, let's say a nickel-based superalloy. Then you will forge it, you will break it, into an ingot, and then you will shape the component from this by machining. Okay, so there is a 3-step, 4-step process. If you now go to an engineer who has made a 3D printer, he will tell you that all this is conventional manufacturing. This is what we used to do in the age of the Mughals probably, and later on, up to the age of 2000. But now we have come up with an idea where if you have a 3D CAD model of a material or of any substance that you make, not substance, of any tool that you want to make, or let's say here the blisk, right? So we have a 3D CAD model. We enter this into a computer which has a robotic arm, and this robotic arm will now spread the powder on a bed, and then it will also give you this blisk. And how does this happen? So this seems like magic, obviously. But what happens is you have a retracting powder bed wherein you have given the instruction to the computer that the laser should run over a certain pattern. And once that pattern has been melted by the laser or the electron beam, what happens is that the bed retracts downwards and then another layer of powder is deposited over the same bed. So it is nothing but layer by layer, piece by piece reconstruction of the material which has been fed into it. And it is done by either melting or sintering the powders using a laser beam or an electron beam. And this is how the process looks like. And with this, we can also see the kind of process parameters that are coming into play. One is you are going to look at the laser beam or the electron beam power, okay? Or you are going to see something known as a hatch distance or hatch spacing. Then the layer thickness, the powder which has been overlaid or which is going to be printed by this laser beam again becomes a factor. Then you have a powder bed, okay? And of course, you are going to see the laser beam diameter. Now the hatch distance and laser beam diameter are slightly different. You can have overlapping laser beams, okay, depending on if you increase or reduce the hatch distance, okay. So these parameters become important. Of course, the laser beam speed is also a parameter. The other thing which comes in is known as your scan strategy or hatching strategy. You can spread the movement or the displacement of the laser beam in different directions to get different kind of results or different kind of mesoscale structures. Okay. So what happens is now we will just look at two very important aspects which are under our control, which is laser power and velocity. Okay. And when we have laser power and velocity, what influence does it have on printing parameters? What we are going to look at is something called a single track melt pool. So what happens is you are assuming that a laser is running over a plane in a straight line, and I am going to cut the cross section of this material and look at it in a metallographic or an optical microscope. Okay, what you see here is that this cross section will show you a melt pool, and immediately you can recognize is very similar to what you see in welding. In welding also you see a similar weld bead. So this is a process which is nothing but welding which is upscaled to build a component. Now the shape of this melt pool, you can obviously see it changes when you change the power and it changes when you change the speed. Either of this parameter, the shape and the aspect ratio of the melt pool changes. And a lot of studies have focused on this aspect. They look at the width and the depth, essentially the aspect ratio of the melt pool. And then they've signed that it increases or decreases depending on the speed as well as the velocity of the laser. Now let us look at the different kind of structural defects that come in AM, and this is important because we are talking about melt pools, and it of course depends on the melt pool as to how the defects are coming in the first place. So the first kind of defect that is always coming in is known as a keyhole porosity, and a keyhole, as you can see, it's nothing but when you use a very high power beam, high power laser beam, and a very low velocity, the power is concentrated at one spot for a long time, which means that the laser will essentially heat a very deep envelope of material, which will result in this kind of a geometry. Okay, a very high aspect ratio geometry. What happens is when this geometry is created, you always have a pore at the bottom of it. There is another type of defect wherein it's called balling, or it's also called bead up. What happens is when you use lower speeds, the material at a particular place start balling up and start solidifying separately from the powder bed. Okay, and this happens at moderate speeds and moderate power. But if you use very high speed and low power, what will happen is you won't have time enough to fuse the material together, which will result in lack of fusion. Okay, and this happens at high speeds and low power. And finally, you will have a process space where you can define at high powers your keyholing will occur because the material or the laser has bored through the material. You can see this keyholing has occurred at lower velocities, and at very high velocities and low power, you see that there's lack of fusion. And in between, you can have bead up. So this process space decides where in the where you can do ideal printing. Okay. And you can see that this particular rectangle which has been shown was identified as ideal space. Unfortunately, even if you do this, you can still not avoid defects completely. Okay. Apart from these, because defects form due to gases in the material, which is released when the laser beam runs over the material. So there are going to be gases that are created, which go and sit inside the material as metallurgical pores or known as gas porosities. You can also, of course, have keyhole porosities for some other reason, but we will look at what essentially leads to that. We will have to live with gas pores anyway because it is inherent to an AM process. It is like a welding or a sintering process. And these are powders which have spherical shapes. So they will always result in some kind of gas porosity. But other pores need to be avoided, such as lack of fusion, balling up, and keyhole geometry. And now we will do the same exercise in an in situ alloyed additive manufacturing setup. So what is in situ alloying? What we do is we use two different materials, titanium and niobium. We mix it together and we form a powder mixture. Okay. And this powder mixture, it is then kept spread over over your 3D printer bed, and then a laser runs over it. And what happens is that it keeps solidifying, and inherently during, this is probably not very homogeneously mixed, but the melt pool is created in such a way that your material there homogenizes itself and then forms a alloy. So that is why it is called in situ alloying. Titanium and niobium were initially separate, but later on they become a titanium niobium alloy. This was done reasonably successfully. But unfortunately, what they saw in the microstructure was the following things. They see keyhole porosities, these white spaces, as well as niobium inclusions. Okay. So these are the two defects which you don't want. You want to avoid these defects because niobium inclusions will create local clustering of grains. Okay, it leads to something known as equiax grain, whereas you want columnar grains. And keyhole porosity obviously has bad effects on fatigue as well as ductility. So you want to avoid these two. So for how does keyhole porosity forms the basis of how we are going to eliminate it. So how do we understand it? We look at a molten melt pool. See that at a very high aspect ratio, and when the laser is scanning in, let's say, left to right, the back end of the pool starts not revolving, rather starts bulging out, and then it goes towards the front end of the pool, and finally, due to your capillary forces or capillary instability, this keyhole collapses. And then you have the storage of a porosity. That is how keyhole porosity essentially forms. And this is shown in two different metals. One is your aluminum alloy and one is your steel. Thus, we come to something known as the porosity inclusion dilemma, which is a fundamental problem in 3D printing. And if you can resolve this problem, you'll be very successful, essentially in building very high quality parts. So the first thing is when you use high power and low speed, you obviously know keyhole porosity will form because the laser will bore through the powder and it will heat quite a lot of material. Okay, because you have low speed, more material is exposed to it and you'll have a high aspect ratio melt pool. Apart from that, you will still have some inclusion, but they will be much lesser than what you would expect. Then we can also do, if we do, let's say, moderate power and speed, we saw that initially the melt track or the single track of the melt pool is terrible. It doesn't look very stable. It sort of forms something like a bead. And if we increase the power and speed further, the melt pool becomes even more messy. What essentially you can do is you can use lower power and very low speed. Of course, that will result in lack of fusion, but then you have some window. You can in fact keep it reasonably low power and reasonably low speed to make sure that the melt pool looks very nice. But the problem with low power and low speed is that you will have more inclusions because you're not inputting more power for the niobium to melt. Niobium has intrinsically a higher melting temperature than titanium. So titanium melts first and niobium sometimes remains as inclusions. So low power, low speed, although creates such a problem, people have been living with it because it is much better than getting a keyhole porosity, which is like a hole in the material. Now what happens is this was done, and then we observed that there were several pores as well as inclusions in the material, which is what caused a lot of problem. So the solution was to change the stripe printing strategy. In the stripe printing strategy, what you do is instead of a single track, what we will move on to is a single stripe strategy. In the single stripe strategy, you will still move in the same direction, but the laser will keep moving back and forth in the perpendicular direction. And then if you look at the material which has been made by this particular strategy, where the laser is moving in probably the direction which is given earlier, but then also perpendicularly moving rapidly, you will see that with increase in power, the porosity and inclusion content keeps decreasing. In fact, for very high power, when we use them, we did not observe any keyhole porosity and had much fewer inclusions. So this printing strategy itself was able to give us a very high quality material. In fact, eliminated keyhole porosity completely, which is actually a very significant landmark. And how does this work? So what we did was we tried to simulate the heat in this kind of a strategy. So this is nothing but your single stripe strategy where your laser is moving in one direction. Okay, this is how it looks like. So it is moving in one direction. You see that small thing is the heat signature of the melt pool. Okay, and this heat signature will keep moving along with the laser beam. Wherever the laser moves, where it moves, because immediately the material will solidify as the surrounding material will cool it. Okay, so our heat signature will only move along with the laser beam wherever the laser beam is. Now what we do is we'll go for the stripe scanning strategy. So stripe scanning strategy, what we have done here is we have used high power and high speed. So the use of high power and high speed, what happens is the melt pool remains molten for a longer period of time, as in the heat is retained for a longer period of time. And because of the higher speed, the return of the laser is so rapid that the melt pool appears to be larger, or rather a larger volume of material has been melted, which allows solidification to take place slowly. The other aspect you see is that the melt pool aspect ratio of the second strategy, the 950 watt strategy, is much lower, which is very important because keyhole porosity can be prevented. So one is by increasing the speed in the stripe scanning strategy, you are actually melting more material for a longer time, allowing homogenization, which reduces the niobium content, and then you finally make melt pool shallower with this strategy because it does not stay in the same place, and that allows more material to not only dissolve or diffuse, but it also allows your keyhole to not occur. Okay. With this, I would like to end my talk because I just showed you different ways in which a materials engineer can analyze things. In fact, this did not even require an engineer to understand the process. The process deals with logic. And then as a materials or a mechanical engineer, you can contribute in different aspects of the structure, process, properties, performance pyramid. Okay, that is very popular in material science and everybody can contribute. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'll be very happy to take a few questions from you.